17 of the world's top neurologists had already signed off on Leo Pendleton's life. They'd looked at his scans, reviewed his charts, and walked out of his room without a second glance, because to them, there was nothing left to look at. 8 months of silence. 8 months of a young man lying perfectly still while machines did the breathing his body had forgotten how to do alone. The family had been told to say goodbye. The hospital had already begun the paperwork. But on the night shift, in a hallway that smelled like bleach and defeat, a rough-edged nurse with dirt under her fingernails and a military discharge on her record crouched beside his bed and watched his left hand twitch. And she knew. They were all wrong. If this story already has you leaning forward, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, follow along so you don't miss a single part, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The hospital sat on the edge of Drayfield, Massachusetts, close enough to the harbor that on still nights you could hear the water from the upper floors. Carver Medical Center had been built with money from naval contracts and private donors, and the architecture showed it. 12 stories of pale stone and reflective glass that caught the morning light and threw it back like something that wanted to be admired. The lobby had marble floors and a donor wall with names etched in brass. The neurological wing on the 7th floor had been featured in 3 separate medical journals. The staff wore that distinction the way some people wear expensive watches, not because they needed anyone to notice, but because it felt wrong when they didn't. Mara Joss arrived for her first night shift at Carver on a Tuesday in late October, when the temperature had dropped fast enough to catch the whole city off guard and half the staff was still in fall jackets. She came through the service entrance because the badge they'd issued her wasn't coded for the main lobby yet, and because she didn't particularly care which door she used. She was 38 years old, lean in the way that came from years of field rations and early mornings rather than any kind of intention. With short brown hair she'd been cutting herself since she was 22, and a scar along the left side of her jaw that she'd stopped trying to explain to people. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and a coffee thermos that had been through 2 deployments and a flood. And she signed in at the nurse's station on 7 without introducing herself to anyone. The charge nurse on duty that night was a woman named Patricia Ellery, who had been working 7 for 11 years and had opinions about most things. She took one look at Mara's intake sheet, at the line that said prior employment, U.S. Army Medical Corps, 11 years, honorable discharge, and her expression shifted in the particular way that meant she'd already made a decision. "You're covering Halloway's patients," Patricia said, not looking up again. "Rooms 704 through 712. 709 is a long term. He won't give you any trouble." "What's in 709? "Leo Pendleton, 24. He's been unresponsive since February." Patricia finally looked at her. "Don't adjust anything in that room without clearing it with the attending first. Dr. Aldrin Voss manages his case. Standing orders are posted inside the door." "What happened to him?" Patricia paused like she was deciding how much the new hire needed to know. "Diving accident, deep water recovery operation. He was underwater for somewhere between 4 and 7 minutes before they pulled him out. The timeline was disputed. Hypoxic brain injury. Initial scans showed significant cortical damage." She set down her clipboard. 17 neurological consults over 8 months. The consensus is persistent vegetative state. His father is Admiral Marcus Pendleton. He's Navy, career, high profile. He visits on Thursdays and sometimes Sundays. When he's here, everything runs smooth and nothing gets questioned. You understand me? "I understand you," Mara said. She didn't say anything else, and Patricia seemed to take that as acceptable. Room 709 was at the end of the corridor, separated from the busier rooms by a small alcove and a supply closet. Someone had taped a laminated schedule to the door, feeding times, repositioning intervals, the medication lineup. And inside the room itself, it was quiet in a way that felt different from the rest of the floor. Not peaceful. Quieter than that. The kind of quiet that had settled in and made itself permanent. Leo Pendleton was long, probably 6'1" or 2, and in 8 months of hospital immobility, he'd lost the physical shape that 24-year-olds were supposed to have. His arms were thin. His face was angular in the way that came from weight loss, not structure. He had dark hair that someone had recently cut close to his head, probably for hygiene reasons, and his eyes were closed, and he didn't move when Mara came through the door. She checked the chart at the foot of the bed first. Read it carefully, which was not something everyone did. She'd learned in the Army that the chart told you what people thought they knew, and what they thought they knew was usually where the errors were buried. 8 months of documentation. She read through the neurological assessments first. Glasgow Coma Scale scores consistently low. EEG reports noting minimal activity. MRI summaries describing hypoxic injury patterns. The language was precise and confident in the way that medical documentation got when the conclusion had been reached before the full picture was assembled. She'd seen that before too. In the field, it showed up as non-survivable injuries stamped across a form while the patient was still breathing. She set the chart down and looked at him. There was a chair by the window, standard issue, the kind that had been sat in by enough anxious family members that the cushion had compressed permanently in the middle. Mara didn't sit. She stood at the side of the bed and watched him the way she'd learned to watch patients in triage. Not for what was obvious, but for what was small. The things that happened at the edges of attention. She stayed there for about 4 minutes. On the 3rd minute, his left hand moved. It wasn't much. A flex of the fingers, barely perceptible, lasting less than a second. His face didn't change. His breathing pattern, monitored and displayed on the screen above the bed, didn't spike. But his hand had moved, and it hadn't been a muscle tremor. She'd seen enough of those to know the difference. A tremor had no direction to it. What his hand had done was pull inward slightly, like a reflex with intent behind it. Mara stood very still. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers lightly against the inside of his wrist, below the pulse point, where the skin was thinner. She said quietly, "Can you hear me?" Nothing happened for 5 seconds. Then his hand moved again. The same inward flex, fractionally stronger. She didn't say anything to Patricia that night. She didn't say anything to anyone. Instead, she spent the rest of her shift doing her rounds carefully and returning to 7:09 between every other patient, spending 3 or 4 minutes each time just watching, just testing small responses. By 3 in the morning, she had documented 6 separate instances of what she was now categorizing privately as directed micro-movement. Responses to either stimulus or auditory input that were too specific to be reflexive noise. The chart said persistent vegetative state. The chart was not describing what she was looking at. Mara had spent 4 years as a forward-deployed combat medic before she'd moved into the Army's Traumatic Brain Injury Rehabilitation Unit at Fort Stills, which was not a posting most people asked for and which had given her 3 years of close-up, hands-on experience with neurological trauma that most civilian nurses never encountered. She'd worked with soldiers who'd come back from blast injuries with the kind of brain damage that civilian protocols had no category for, and she'd been part of a small team that had developed assessment methods specifically designed to detect awareness in patients who couldn't express it through standard channels. The military hadn't published those methods in journals. They'd developed them in the field because the field required it. What she was seeing in Leo Pendleton looked familiar, not identical. The injury mechanism was different, hypoxic rather than blast-related, but the pattern of response was close enough to make her careful, close enough to make her want a lot more data before she said a word to anyone. She started keeping her own notes. Small notebook, personal property, not part of the official chart. She wrote down timestamps, stimulus types, response descriptions, duration. She drew up a rough grid. After 5 nights, it had enough entries that she could see the pattern clearly. His responses were more pronounced in the early morning hours, between 2 and 4 a.m. They increased with direct verbal address. They decreased when the room's ambient noise was higher. That was not random neurological firing. That was a system that was processing input and generating output in a way that was constrained by something, by what, she didn't know yet, but constrained, not absent. She went to the medical library database on her off days and pulled everything she could find on hypoxic encephalopathy and disorders of consciousness, specifically the literature on covert cortical processing, cases where patients with minimal external responsiveness demonstrated intact cognitive function on specialized imaging. There was a body of work on it, not large but growing, out of several European research centers and 2 American university hospitals. The imaging protocols required were not standard. They were not something Carver Medical Center appeared to be using. She also found the name of the doctor who managed Leo's case. Dr. Aldrin Voss was 53, had been chief of neurology at Carver for 9 years, and had a publication record that was genuinely impressive. He was not, based on what she could access, a researcher in disorders of consciousness specifically. His work was surgical, focused on tumor resection and vascular interventions. He was a credentialed, accomplished neurologist, but the subspecialty that was most relevant to what she was looking at was not his area. The 17 consultants whose reports were in Leo's chart were a mixed group. Some general neurology, some critical care. One who had actually published in the consciousness literature, but whose report was 18 months old and had been conducted before the pattern she was currently tracking had time to consolidate. She spent a long time sitting with that. She asked for a meeting with Voss on her 9th day. She'd prepared notes, not from her personal notebook, which she kept to herself, but a summary she'd written out, organized, stripped of speculation, and limited to observable findings with timestamps. She'd been careful about the language. She wasn't claiming anything. She was presenting data and asking for additional assessment. His office was on the 6th floor with a window that looked out toward the harbor. The desk had the organized density of someone who worked hard and knew it. He was shorter than she'd expected from the faculty photo, with the kind of compact authority that came from decades of being the most technically proficient person in any given room. He looked at her summary for about 90 seconds. Then he set it down. "You've been on this unit for 9 days, he said. That's correct? And in 9 days you've developed a theory that contradicts the consensus of 17 neurological assessments conducted over 8 months. She'd expected that framing. I'm not contradicting the assessments. I'm presenting observable data that I believe warrants additional testing, specifically functional MRI with the covert cognition protocol, or fMRI, with motor imagery paradigm. The existing imaging was performed before those protocols were widely adopted and doesn't rule out. I know what the protocols are, Voss said. His voice was level, not raised, but there was something behind it that she recognized. She'd heard that register before, in senior officers who didn't appreciate having their conclusions revisited by someone with a lower rank. And I can tell you that we considered specialized imaging and determined the clinical picture did not support the cost and procedural burden given the scan results we already had. The scan results show structural damage. They don't rule out functional processing through alternative pathways. Ms. Joss. He picked up the summary and aligned it with the edge of his desk in a gesture that meant he was done reading it. I understand that your background is in field medicine. That's a valuable skill set in the right context, but what you're describing would require me to reopen a case that has been evaluated thoroughly by specialists with considerably more training in this area than you have, and to justify that reopening to the patient's family, to Admiral Pendleton, based on observations made by a night shift nurse with 9 days of tenure at this hospital. Based on observations that are documented and reproducible, she said. Documented in a personal notebook, he said. He'd apparently noticed that detail. Not in the official chart. I didn't put them in the chart because I wanted to discuss them with the attending before making any official notations. There was a pause. Outside the window, a gull crossed the harbor light. I appreciate that you care about your patients, Voss said. Genuinely. But I need you to understand that what you're asking for has implications you may not be fully considering. Admiral Pendleton has been through 8 months of assessment and difficult counseling. He is a public figure. What you're suggesting would mean telling him there's a possibility, a speculative possibility, that his son has been conscious and trapped for some or all of that time. Do you understand what that would do to that man? She met his eyes. I understand what it would mean if he is conscious and we don't check. Voss held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood, which meant the meeting was over. I'm going to make a note of this conversation, he said, and I'm going to ask you to limit your interactions with the patient in 709 to standard nursing care. If you have clinical concerns, document them in the chart through proper channels, and they will be reviewed. He moved toward the door. I'll also be speaking with your charge nurse about scope of practice. Patricia called her into the station alcove the next afternoon before shift started. The conversation was brief. Voss had called. Patricia was sorry, but she needed to understand that challenging a physician's diagnosis without clinical authority to do so was not just a scope issue, it was a liability issue. If Mara filed a formal complaint, she was within her rights, but the hospital would respond to that formally. and she should think carefully about what she wanted her first month at Carver to look like. "I'm not filing a complaint," Mara said. "Good." Patricia looked relieved, then slightly guilty about looking relieved. "Then let's just move forward." Mara nodded and went to get her assignments. She wasn't angry. She'd expected something like this, not because she thought Voss was a bad doctor, but because she understood systems. Institutions had mass. They moved in one direction until something significant stopped them, and the kind of reversal Voss was being asked to consider would require him to admit that his unit had potentially failed a patient for 8 months. That kind of admission had consequences: professional, legal, reputational. She didn't think he was deliberately ignoring Leo Pendleton. She thought he was doing what people inside large institutions did when the cost of being wrong was too high to calculate. He was declining to look. She went about her shift. She kept her interactions with 709 within the scope of standard care. She did not make additional notes in her personal notebook while on duty, but she didn't stop thinking. On her 14th night, a Thursday, Admiral Marcus Pendleton came in late. Patricia had mentioned he sometimes came on Thursdays outside visiting hours. The hospital made allowances for him, but Mara hadn't crossed paths with him yet. She heard him before she saw him, not loudly, but the way military men moved through civilian spaces sometimes created a kind of atmospheric shift that she'd learned to notice. He was in the corridor outside 709 when she came around from the supply alcove, and he stopped when he saw her. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been weathered by decades of saltwater and institutional responsibility. He wore civilian clothes, dark jacket, no tie, but he wore them the way people wore costumes over uniforms. He looked at her badge. "New," he said. "Night shift. Mara Joss." He studied her for a moment with the particular attentiveness of someone accustomed to reading people quickly. "Military?" "Army, Medical Corps." Something in his expression shifted slightly, not quite softening, but acknowledging. "How long has he been assigned to you?" 2 weeks. He nodded. He didn't ask for a report, didn't ask how Leo was doing in the way that family members usually asked, with a kind of flinching hope that she had to be careful not to feed too much. He just nodded, and then he looked toward the closed door of 709 with the expression she'd seen on exactly one other type of person. Senior officers at field hospitals, standing outside rooms where the prognosis had already been delivered, and there was nothing left to do but remain. "You can go in," she said. "I just finished his repositioning." "I know," he said. "I just needed a minute." She left him there. She went to finish her charting. But 20 minutes later, when she came back down the corridor for medication rounds, his voice came through the partially open door of 709, low, controlled, the kind of voice that had given orders in bad weather and expected them to be followed. "Told your mother I'd bring you home. I'm going to need you to give me something to work with here, Leo." Mara paused outside the door. There was silence from the room. And then a sound. Not words, not any formed vocalization, but a sound from the bed. A short, effortful exhalation, pitched slightly differently from the passive respiratory rhythm she'd memorized over 14 nights. She pushed the door open. The Admiral was standing at the bedside, both hands gripping the side rail, looking at his son. Leo's face was angled slightly toward the sound of the voice, which was not where it had been positioned when she'd left the room 20 minutes ago. His left hand was on top of the blanket. The fingers were not relaxed. Pendleton turned and looked at her. His expression was the kind that had been trained to give nothing away, but something underneath it was barely contained. "Did you see that?" he said. "Yes," Mara said. She came to the side of the bed, and she picked up Leo's left hand carefully, and she pressed her thumb gently against the center of his palm. She said quietly, "Leo, squeeze if you can hear me." The room was completely silent, and then, slowly, imprecisely, with the enormous effort of something that had been locked up for a very long time, the fingers closed. Admiral Marcus Pendleton made a sound she'd never heard from a man with his bearing. Not a word, not a command. Something older than either of those things. Mara kept her eyes on Leo. His grip lasted about 3 seconds. Then his hand went slack again, and his breathing returned to its baseline, and he was still. But she was already making the decision she'd been building toward for 2 weeks. She turned to the Admiral and she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to me all the way through before you respond, because this is going to be hard to hear, and it's going to make you very angry, and the anger is going to want to go somewhere, and where it goes in the next 10 minutes is going to matter." Pendleton looked at her with eyes that had been carrying 8 months of controlled grief, and he said, "Talk." She gave him the short version first because that was the version he could absorb standing up. She told him she'd been observing Leo for 2 weeks, that she'd documented consistent directed responses to auditory and tactile stimulus, that the pattern was not consistent with persistent vegetative state as defined by current diagnostic standards, and that the imaging protocols used in his son's assessments did not include the functional studies that would be required to detect covert cortical processing. Pendleton listened without interrupting. His hands stayed on the side rail. His face stayed controlled. But she could see the muscles along his jaw working, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment that lasted just long enough to feel like the pause before a pressure system broke. "How long?" he said. "I've been tracking it for 2 weeks. How long it's been present, I don't know. I can't tell you that. But it could have been there longer." She didn't soften it. "Yes, it could have been." The sound he made then was not loud and not directed at her, but it filled the room completely. He turned away and looked at his son, and she let him have that, because there was nothing she could say that would help with what he was currently doing the math on. 8 months. If Leo had been processing, responding, aware in some interior sense, 8 months of that room, that silence, that particular quality of being present in a body that the world had decided was empty. "What do you need?" Pendleton finally said. "I need the attending to authorize functional imaging, specifically fMRI with a covert cognition protocol. There's a team at Harwich University Medical that runs this specific assessment. They've published on it. It would require transferring Leo for the imaging or bringing their team here." "And the attending is Voss?" "Yes." "Who already told you no?" "Who told me the clinical picture didn't support additional testing?" Pendleton turned back from the bed. The grief was still there in his face, but it had company now. Something colder and more purposeful that she recognized from men who'd been handed an impossible problem and were actively calculating how to dismantle it. "I'll talk to Voss in the morning," he said. "Admiral," she said it carefully, "I want you to know what you're walking into. Voss is credentialed and well-regarded, and he has the weight of a 17-consult consensus behind him. If you go in there citing what a 2-week night shift nurse told you at 11 p.m., the conversation is going to be very short, and it's going to end in a way that makes it harder to get the imaging approved. He needs to hear a clinical argument, and the clinical argument needs to come from someone whose authority he'll have difficulty dismissing." "So what are you telling me to do?" "I'm telling you to be patient for 72 hours while I build the kind of case that can survive that conversation. I need to put my documented observations formally into the chart, which I can do tonight. And I need to contact the Harwich team independently to get a preliminary opinion on whether the data I have is sufficient to justify their involvement." He looked at her for a long moment. And that look was the particular scrutiny of someone deciding very quickly whether to trust a source they had no prior reason to trust. "You've been in," he said. Not a question. 4 years forward deployed, 3 years TBI rehab at Fort Stills. Fort Stills. He filed that. "Who ran the neuro program there when you were assigned?" "Colonel Iris Tatum. She retired out of Walter Reed 2 years ago." He nodded once, and she understood that he probably knew the name, or knew someone who did, because that was how those networks operated. She wasn't asking him to take her word for it. She was giving him a thread he could pull. 72 hours, he said. 72 hours. He looked at his son one more time, and then he left the room, and Mara stood alone in 709 with Leo's quiet breathing and the weight of what she'd just set in motion. She entered the formal observations into the chart that night, all of them, time-stamped and described in clinical language, cross-referenced against the existing nursing notes to establish the timeline clearly. She was precise, and she was careful, and she did not overstate anything. When she was done, the entry ran to almost 3 pages, which was unusual for nursing documentation, and which she knew would be read by Voss before morning rounds. She went home at 6 a.m. and slept for 4 hours, which was what she usually managed, and then she opened her laptop and found the published contact information for the Disorders of Consciousness Research Unit at Harwich University Medical Center, 200 miles south in Providence. The lead researcher was a woman named Dr. Solène Price, who had published 9 papers on covert cortical processing and co-developed one of the 2 fMRI paradigms currently considered valid for detecting awareness in patients with disorders of consciousness. Mara composed an email that took her 40 minutes to write, not because she didn't know what she wanted to say, but because she was choosing every word to carry maximum information in minimum space, the way she'd learned to write field reports. She described the case, the injury mechanism, the timeline, the observations, and the specific characteristics of the responses she'd been tracking. She attached the summary she'd originally prepared for Voss, the one he'd set aside in 11 seconds. She sent the email at 10:17 in the morning and then sat looking at her phone for a while before accepting that there was nothing else she could do in the next few hours and making herself eat something. Voss called her at 2 in the afternoon. She was still at home. She let it ring once before answering. "Miss Joss." His voice was even, but the evenness was doing more work than usual. "I've reviewed your chart entries from last night. Okay? I want to be clear about something. The purpose of nursing documentation is to record observations relevant to the ongoing care plan. It is not a vehicle for challenging physician diagnoses. I documented clinical observations in the patient's official record," she said. "That's within my scope. What you documented is a series of anecdotal nursing observations that you are now framing, implicitly, as evidence of awareness in a patient whose neurological status has been determined by specialist consensus. That framing is going to create distress for the family. The family has already seen the responses I documented," she said. "Admiral Pendleton was present in the room last night. He observed a directed grip response." There was a pause. "He was there outside visiting hours," Voss said. "He was. And he witnessed it directly." Another pause, longer. She could hear him recalibrating. "I'll be speaking with Admiral Pendleton this week," Voss said. "And I want you to understand that what you've done, entering documentation designed to reopen a closed case without discussing it with the attending first, is a serious professional matter. I will be filing a formal note regarding scope concerns." "That's your right," she said. "It is. A beat. And I would ask you, seriously, to consider whether you want to continue down this path. You've been at Carver for 2 weeks. Whatever your intentions are, you do not have the clinical standing to manage this outcome." She thought about Leo's hand closing around her thumb. 3 seconds. She thought about the amount of effort that had taken, whatever constituted effort when you were locked inside a body that wasn't responding to you anymore. "I appreciate the call," she said, and ended it. Dr. Solène Price responded to the email at 6:47 that evening with a message that was 4 sentences long and ended with a phone number and the words, "Call me tonight if you can." Mara called her at 7. Price was in her mid-40s and spoke with the focused economy of someone who spent most of her working hours trying to get people to take seriously a clinical problem that the broader medical community still treated as fringe. She'd read the summary carefully. "The response pattern you're describing," Price said, "the diurnal variation, the differential response to direct address versus ambient noise, the directed motor component, that's not vegetative." "That's what I thought. I can't tell you what it is from what you've sent me, but I can tell you it's not consistent with the diagnosis on record." She paused. "You know what you're dealing with here. If this is what it looks like, that patient has been—" "I know," Mara said, "and the hospital is resistant. The attending filed a scope concern against me this afternoon." Price made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but carried the recognition of someone who'd heard that story before. "Is the family engaged?" "The patient's father was present for one of the response episodes last night. He's ready to push for imaging." "Then we have a path." Price was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I can't authorize an assessment without a physician referral. It pas so. You know that. But if Admiral Pendleton requests a formal second opinion and names our unit specifically, and if his request goes to hospital administration rather than to Voss directly, administration is going to have a very hard time denying it, given who he is and what the liability picture looks like if he escalates. And if Voss goes to administration first and frames it as a rogue nurse creating a problem, then it becomes a contested case, and administration has to weigh the cost of a liability suit from an admiral against the cost of ruffling their chief of neurology. Price paused. Neither outcome is great for you professionally, I'll be honest. I know that too. Why are you doing this? It wasn't a challenging question. It was a real one, the kind people asked when they were deciding how seriously to take you. Because he squeezed back, Mara said, and nobody else in that hospital is going to do anything about it. Price was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, okay, here's what I need you to get me. Pendleton called her at 8 the next morning. She gave him Price's name and the Harwick unit's information and walked him through exactly how to structure the request for the second opinion, to whom to address it, what language to use, and the fact that it needed to go to Carver's chief medical officer, not to Voss's department. Voss is going to know it came from you, Pendleton said. Yes. Are you prepared for what happens after that? I've been prepared for it since I put those observations in the chart, she said. He was quiet for a moment. My son is going to know what you did for him, he said, when this is over. She didn't say anything to that. It wasn't the reason she was doing it, and it wasn't the kind of thing she knew how to respond to. Make the call to the CMO today, she said, before Voss gets ahead of it. He made the call at 9:15. By noon, the chief medical officer, a woman named Dr. Patricia Senge, who had been managing institutional risk at Carver for 6 years, and who understood immediately what a formal second opinion request from a naval admiral looked like in terms of exposure, had convened an emergency meeting with Voss, the head of nursing, and the hospital's legal counsel. Mara was not in that meeting. She was told about it by Patricia Ellery at the start of her shift, delivered in the flat tone of someone who was delivering news they weren't sure how to classify. They're reviewing your chart entries, Patricia said. Formal review. You're on modified duty pending the outcomes. Yes, you can do your rounds, but you're not to interact with the patient in 709 until this is resolved. How long does the review take? The CMO is moving fast on this. My understanding is they want a resolution before Admiral Pendleton escalates outside the hospital. Mara nodded. She picked up her assignment list. Mara. Patricia stopped her with a hand briefly on her arm, the first time she'd used her first name. I need you to know that I've seen your documentation. I've read all of it. She paused. I think you might be right. I know I am. Patricia let go of her arm. That doesn't mean this ends well for you. It didn't end well for her, in the immediate sense. By 10 that night, formal charges had been filed against her with the nursing board. Not by Patricia, but by Voss, who had apparently decided that offense was the better position once the CMO meeting made clear that the administration was not going to simply back him without conducting a review. The charges cited scope violations, inappropriate documentation practices, and what the filing described as deliberate circumvention of attending physician authority resulting in patient and family distress. Patricia informed her of the charges at 10:45, standing in the corridor outside the medication room with the particular careful expression of someone delivering a blow they'd been asked to deliver and didn't enjoy. Mara read the notification on the tablet Patricia handed her. Read it through twice. I need a union rep, she said. I've already put in the call, Patricia said. They'll contact you in the morning. In 709? You're relieved of that assignment pending resolution. Someone else will cover it. Mara handed the tablet back. She finished her shift doing her other rounds, professionally, completely, without comment. At 6 in the morning, she signed out and walked to the service entrance and stood in the cold for a moment looking at the harbor. She wasn't done. She knew she wasn't done. But there was a specific leaden quality to the moment, because she'd known this part was coming and knowing it hadn't made it lighter. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out expecting the union rep's scheduling message. It was a text from an unknown number. 4 words, no signature. Price is coming tomorrow. She stared at it. Then she looked up at the gray harbor, at the water catching the early light, and she thought about Leo Pendleton in that room on the 7th floor, with a different nurse now, someone who wouldn't know to watch his hands. Her phone buzzed again. Same number, 3 more words. Don't go anywhere. And then, before she could respond, a third message, this one containing a name she recognized immediately, a name she hadn't heard in 3 years, attached to a rank she hadn't expected. The person who'd sent it was not Price. The person who'd sent it was someone who had no reason to know she was standing outside Carver Medical Center at 6 in the morning unless they'd been watching this situation from a distance that she hadn't accounted for, through channels she hadn't opened. Her hand tightened on the phone. Someone else already knew about Leo Pendleton, and whoever it was, they'd been watching long enough to know exactly when to move. She stood there long enough for the cold to work its way through her jacket, reading that name on the screen 3 times because the first 2 times didn't fully register. Commander Delia Fursh. She'd last seen Fursh in a forward operating base in a country she didn't name in civilian conversation, in a tent that smelled like diesel and antiseptic, during a handoff briefing that had ended with Fursh telling her the TBI program at Fort Stills was being expanded and that Mara's transfer was already written up. Fursh had been Naval Intelligence Liaison to the Joint Medical Command at the time, which meant she operated in the exact overlap between military medicine and institutional oversight that most people didn't know existed. She was precise, methodical, and had a memory for case details that had made her invaluable in exactly the kind of situations where the official record and the actual situation had diverged. Mara typed back, "How long have you been tracking this?" The response came in under a minute. "Since February. Come to the Aldgate Hotel on Merchant Street. Room 214. 8 a.m. It was currently 6:17. She walked. The Aldgate was 12 blocks from the hospital, a mid-tier business hotel that catered to contractors and government visitors passing through Dreyfield's Naval Infrastructure Corridor. Room 214 was on the 2nd floor, and when Mara knocked at 8:02, the door opened before she'd finished the second knock. Fursh was 50, maybe 51 now, with close-cropped silver hair she'd apparently stopped fighting sometime in the last 3 years, and the same economy of movement that Mara remembered. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. She was in civilian clothes, dark slacks, and a gray pullover, and she had 2 coffees on the small desk beside a laptop and a folder that was closed. "You look like you haven't slept," Fursh said. "4 hours, what is this?" Fursh gestured to the chair across the desk. Mara sat. Fursh sat across from her and opened the folder, turning it so Mara could read. What she was looking at was a Naval Medical Command internal assessment, not classified technically, but not publicly circulated, dated 6 months ago. It was a review of hypoxic injury outcomes in active duty and recently separated personnel, cross-referenced with civilian hospital admissions. Leo Pendleton's case was on page 4, identified by case number rather than name, but the details were specific enough that she recognized it immediately. Leo was on the list because of his father, Fursh said. Admiral Pendleton reported the accident through the chain. Standard procedure when the family member of an active duty flag officer is admitted following a service-related incident. Leo was on a naval research vessel when it happened. That put the case on Naval Medical Command's radar for follow-up. But nobody followed up. Someone reviewed the initial assessments and noted the civilian hospital's diagnosis. The review concluded that the civilian specialists had adequately assessed the case. Fursh paused. That review was conducted by a contractor, a medical consulting firm, and that firm has a contract relationship with Carver Medical Center. Mara looked up from the folder. The contractor was reviewing cases for Naval Medical Command, Fursh continued, while simultaneously having a financial arrangement with the hospital whose diagnosis they were evaluating. That's a conflict of interest. It's more than that. The contractor's lead reviewer on this case was a former colleague of Voss's. They trained together at Johns Hopkins, and the contract with Naval Medical Command specifies independent review. Fursh closed the folder. Nobody would have found it if your documentation hadn't flagged the case again. When Pendleton's request for a second opinion went to Carver's CMO yesterday, a copy went to Naval Medical Command through the Admiral's office. Someone there sent it to me. Why you? Because I've been building a broader review of this contractor's work for 8 months, and this is the fourth case where their independent assessment conveniently aligned with the treating hospital's original diagnosis despite anomalous findings in the record. She looked at Mara steadily. Your documentation is the anomalous finding that blows this one open. Mara sat with that for a moment. She'd walked into a hospital 14 days ago to cover a night shift and had somehow walked into the edge of something that had been developing for months in a completely separate institutional world. Voss filed nursing board charges against me last night, she said. I know. That was fast, which means he's scared. First pulled a business card from the folder and slid it across the desk. This is a JAG attorney who handles military-civilian medical oversight cases. She's expecting your call. She'll file for an emergency stay of the board proceedings while the Naval Medical Command review is active. Can she do that? She can argue it. The grounds are that the charges were filed in direct response to documentation that is now material evidence in a federal oversight review. It's not guaranteed, but it shifts the frame. First picked up her coffee. The more immediate problem is Leo Pendleton. While you're on modified duty and the board proceeding is pending, no one at Carver is going to authorize the imaging. Price is coming today. Price can't conduct an assessment without hospital authorization, and Voss still controls Leo's case officially. First set the coffee down. Unless Pendleton pulls his son from Carver entirely and transfers him. That takes time, and moving a patient in Leo's condition is a risk, First said. I know, but leaving him there while this works through institutional channels is also a risk, and the longer this takes, the more time Voss has to build a defensive position. Mara looked at the folder, then at the window, where the harbor was visible in the distance through a gap between buildings. There's a faster way, she said. First waited. If Price conducts a preliminary clinical assessment, not imaging, just direct evaluation, and that assessment generates enough clinical concern to constitute an emergency presentation, Carver's ER is obligated to respond regardless of standing orders on the neurology ward. You'd need someone to admit Leo as an emergency. His father can do that. If Leo shows a significant response during Price's assessment and Pendleton brings him through the ER as an acute change in clinical status, the ER attending has to evaluate. That evaluation goes around Voss entirely. First was quiet for a moment. That's not how the system is supposed to work. No, Mara agreed. And if the response isn't significant enough during Price's assessment, you've moved a fragile patient for nothing and given Voss documentation that you tried to engineer a clinical emergency. I know. She picked up Firsch's card. But Leo's been in that room for 8 months. I'm not willing to let bureaucratic timeline be the reason it becomes 9. Dr. Solène Price arrived at the Aldgate at 11, having driven up from Providence through fog that had settled over the coast and showed no intention of moving. She was shorter than Mara had pictured from the email, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the slightly distracted energy of someone whose brain was always running 3 conversations behind whatever their mouth was doing. She shook Mara's hand, nodded to Firsch, sat down, and opened her bag. I can't do a formal assessment outside the hospital, she said immediately. I need you both to understand that. Whatever happens today, I'm there as a consulting physician invited by the family, and my findings are preliminary until I have imaging to back them up. Understood, Mara said. Walk me through the response pattern again, specifically the diurnal component. Mara walked her through it, the full version this time, from the first night to the grip response with Pendleton present, including the characteristics she'd observed in the early morning hours. Price asked 4 questions, all of them specific, all of them aimed at the same thing, distinguishing between reflexive motor activity and purposeful response. Mara's answers held up against each one. You have field training in minimally conscious state assessment, Price said. It wasn't quite a question. Fort Stills, 3 years in the TBI rehab unit under Colonel Tatum's program. Tatum's protocol. Price wrote something in the margin of the notes she'd been taking. That program documented 12 cases of covert awareness in patients previously diagnosed PVS. It was never formally published because the Army buried it in procedural review. She said it the way people stated facts they'd long since stopped being surprised by. If your assessment aligns with what Tatum's people were seeing at Fort Stills, then this patient has likely been in a minimally conscious state or higher for some portion of the 8 months he's been in that room. The room was quiet for a moment. "Let's go see him," Price said. Teak. Pendleton met them in the hospital parking garage, which was Mara's suggestion. Not in the lobby, not where anyone from neurology would see the configuration and understand what was happening before they had a chance to control the narrative. He looked like he'd slept less than she had, and when he saw Price, he extended his hand and then didn't seem to know what to say, which was the most unguarded she'd seen him. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Let's see what we have," Price said, which was probably the right response. They went up through the east stairwell. Mara was technically on modified duty and had no authority to be on the neurology ward, a fact she was choosing to process later. Pendleton had unlimited visiting access, and Price was entering as a family-requested consultant, which was within the family's rights regardless of Voss's standing orders. The combination was not bulletproof, but it was defensible. The morning shift nurse outside 709 was a young man named Garrett, who Mara knew slightly and who looked at the group approaching with visible uncertainty. "Admiral," he said. "My son's consultant," Pendleton said, indicating Price. "She's here for a family-requested evaluation." Garrett looked at Mara. "I'm with the family," she said. He stepped back. It wasn't authorization exactly, but it was the path of least confrontation, and sometimes that was what you worked with. The room was the same. Leo was the same. Position, still, the monitors running their quiet arithmetic above him. Price went to the bedside without ceremony, set her bag down, and began a structured assessment that Mara recognized as a modified version of the CRSR, the Coma Recovery Scale, revised, which was the current standard for detecting awareness and disorders of consciousness. She worked methodically: auditory function, visual function, motor function, oromotor, communication, arousal. She used specific stimuli, documented each response, gave adequate processing time between items. Pendleton stood by the window. His hands were at his sides. He didn't speak. 12 minutes in, Price asked Leo to squeeze her hand if he could hear her. He didn't respond immediately. 6 seconds. 8. Mara watched the monitors, watching for the subtle HR variation she'd come to recognize as the precursor to a response. It came at 11 seconds, a small uptick in heart rate, less than 10 beats per minute, but present, consistent. And then Leo's fingers moved. Not the abbreviated flex she'd been documenting for 2 weeks. His hand closed, incompletely but unmistakably, around Price's fingers, and held for a count of 4 before releasing. Price didn't react visibly. She documented it, asked him to open his hand if he could hear her, waited. His fingers extended slightly. Not a full open, but an effortful, directed movement away from the closed position. "Leo," Price said, her voice level and clear. "I'm going to ask you one more thing. If you can hear me, move your eyes toward the window." 8 seconds. His eyes opened. Mara had seen them open before, in the reflexive, unfocused way that could be consistent with vegetative state. This was different. His eyes opened, and then, slowly, with the enormous effort of a system that had been attempting this for longer than anyone had been watching for it, they moved. Tracking. Not fully, not cleanly, but the direction was unambiguous. Toward the window, toward the light, toward where his father was standing. Pendleton made a sound. He crossed the room in 3 steps and was at the side of the bed before Mara could have said anything, even if she'd had something to say. "I'm here," Pendleton said. His voice was completely broken. "I'm right here, Leo." Leo's eyes didn't move again, but they stayed open for another 30 seconds before closing, and his hand, lying on the blanket near his father's, flexed once more, slow and deliberate, in the direction of the larger hand that had closed around it. Price turned from the bed and looked at Mara. Her face was professionally composed, but underneath it was something tightly controlled, the kind of expression you wore when you were looking at a conclusion you'd known was coming and it still hit you anyway. "This patient is not in a persistent vegetative state," she said quietly. "He is at minimum minimally conscious. Depending on what the imaging shows, he may be significantly above that threshold." She wrote something on her notepad and tore the page off. "I'm filing a formal preliminary assessment as consulting physician. This goes into the record today." Voss is going to challenge it, Mara said. Let him challenge it. Price capped her pen. I've testified in 3 federal oversight cases. He can challenge whatever he wants. Tim. What happened next moved faster than Mara had expected and slower than she needed it to. Price's preliminary assessment hit the official record at 1:17 p.m., filed under the family's right to an independent clinical opinion. By 2 o'clock, Voss had been notified and had immediately requested an emergency department medical review board convening, a formal process that would take 24 to 48 hours and during which, he argued, no changes should be made to Leo's care plan. The CMO, Dr. Senge, approved the convening request, which was procedurally correct and also meant that the imaging Price was recommending was not going to happen today. Mara got this information from Fersh, who was tracking the administrative chain from her hotel room. She was standing in the hospital parking garage again, which had become her unofficial base of operations for things she couldn't do inside the building. He's buying time, she said. Yes, Fersh said, and he has enough institutional cover to buy 48 hours, maybe more. The question is what he does with that time. He tries to discredit Price's assessment before the board convenes. That's my read. Her preliminary assessment is strong, but it's preliminary set. She doesn't have imaging to back it up. If he can get even one of his consulting neurologists to file a counter opinion before the board meets, the board has competing clinical opinions from credentialed physicians, and suddenly it's not clear-cut. Mara thought for a moment. Can the transfer happen faster than the board review? Pendleton is working on it, but transferring a patient in Leo's condition requires the accepting facility to confirm capacity and the transport to be medically supervised. Minimum 6 hours to arrange, realistically 12 to 24. Fersh paused. There's something else. One of Voss's consulting neurologists, a Dr. Thomas Breck, who filed 2 of the original assessments, just arrived at Carver. He wasn't scheduled. Mara went still. He's here to file the counter opinion. Within the next 2 hours, I'd guess. If Breck filed a counter opinion backed by his own assessment of Leo today, Price's preliminary findings would be balanced against a directly competing clinical judgment from a physician who had been formally involved in the case. The board would have grounds to maintain status quo during review, and during that review, Leo remained in 709 under Voss's care plan, which meant no specialized imaging, no change in treatment, no progress. She looked at her phone. She looked at the hospital entrance. She knew what she was about to do was going to cost her whatever remained of her standing at Carver Medical Center. She knew it was going to give Voss additional material for the nursing board charges. She knew Fersh would probably tell her to wait, and that waiting was probably the more defensible choice. She went back inside. She found Breck in the 7th floor corridor, just outside the nursing station, reviewing something on his phone before he went into 709. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to his opinions being the last word in a room. He saw her and didn't place her immediately. Dr. Breck, she said. Mara Joss, I've been covering Leo Pendleton's care on night shift. You're the nurse who filed the documentation, he said. His voice was flat. I am, and I need 60 seconds before you go in there. Ms. Joss, I'm here to conduct a clinical assessment, not 30 seconds, she said, because what I'm going to tell you is going to matter to you professionally, and I'd rather you hear it from me before the Naval Medical Command review becomes public. He paused. He didn't tell her to move out of his way, which meant something had registered. The contractor who reviewed Leo's case for Naval Medical Command has a direct financial relationship with Carver Medical Center, she said. The lead reviewer is a former associate of Dr. Voss. That review is now under investigation as a conflict of interest under federal contract oversight regulations. Your original assessments are part of the case file. She held his gaze. If you file a counter opinion today that contradicts Dr. Price's preliminary findings, and the imaging subsequently confirms awareness, you'll be holding a document that says you evaluated this patient and found no consciousness. Filed the same day, a federal investigation into the review of his case was opened. Breck's face had gone very still. That's the position you'd be in, she said. I think you should know that before you decide what to put in the record. She moved past him and went to the stairwell door. She was almost through it when she heard him, not to her, but to someone on his phone, His voice clipped and controlled. "Get me Aldrin. Now." She didn't stop. She went down the stairs and back to the garage and called Fersh. "Breck's calling Voss," she said. "I heard." A pause. "How did you—" "You know what? It doesn't matter. That either bought you time or accelerated something. We'll know in about 30 minutes. It was 34 minutes. Fersh called back, and her voice, for the first time since Mara had walked into room 214 that morning, had a different quality. Not excitement. Fersh didn't do excitement. But a compression, like someone who'd been holding tension for a long time and had just felt the load shift. "Breck withdrew," she said. "He called Voss and then he called the CMO's office and informed them he was recusing himself from any further involvement in the Pendleton case due to a conflict he'd just become aware of. No counter-opinion filed." Mara leaned against the concrete wall of the parking garage. "That means the board convenes tomorrow with only Price's assessment on record," Fersh said. "No competing clinical opinion, and I just got confirmation that the Naval Medical Command is sending a formal liaison to that board meeting." "Who?" "Me," Fersh said. The word landed cleanly, no drama, just the flat statement of a position that changed the entire geometry of tomorrow's proceeding. Fersh at that table meant the federal oversight thread was no longer background context. It was in the room, in uniform, sitting across from a hospital administration that was about to realize exactly how exposed they were. "Get some sleep," Fersh said. "Tomorrow is going to require you functional." Mara drove home. She ate something she didn't taste. She set an alarm for 5 a.m. and lay down and stared at the ceiling and thought about Leo, about his hand closing for 4 seconds around Price's fingers, about the 8 months that had passed before anyone had been in that room who was paying the right kind of attention. She was asleep before she finished the thought. Her phone woke her at 3:47 a.m. It was Garrett, the nurse from the 7th floor, the one who'd stepped back and let them into 709 that morning. His voice was tight. "Something's happening with your patient," he said. "He's seizing. It started about 10 minutes ago, and it's not stopping. Voss is on his way in, and they're prepping to intubate, and I don't—" He stopped. "I thought you should know." She was already out of bed. "Garrett, listen to me carefully. Do not let anyone alter his medication protocol until I get there. Tell them you need to verify the current med list before any changes. Stall if you have to. Do you understand?" "I can't stall a seizure protocol. Who's the ER attending tonight?" "Dr. Lena Voss." "Call Voss directly, not through Voss. Tell her the patient has an active Naval Medical Command oversight flag on his case, and that any emergency protocol changes need to be documented with that flag active. She'll know what that means." A beat. "Garrett, he is conscious in there. Whatever is happening is not just a seizure. Someone needs to know what they're looking at before they make any decisions." She ended the call and grabbed her jacket and keys. Whatever had triggered the seizure, whether it was neurological progression, medication interaction, or something else entirely, Leo was in a crisis event right now, alone in that room with a team that still officially believed he wasn't aware of anything, and Voss was 20 minutes away and had every reason in the world to manage this emergency in a way that closed the case before tomorrow's board meeting ever happened. She hit the lobby of her building at a run. The drive took 11 minutes. She ran 2 red lights and didn't think about it. The ER entrance was bright in the pre-dawn dark, and she went through it without slowing, badged through the interior door on the residual access that hadn't been revoked yet. Modified duty meant ward restriction, not full badge suspension, a bureaucratic gap that she was currently grateful for, and took the stairs to 7 because the elevator was too slow and she needed the 30 seconds of physical effort to get her head organized before she walked into whatever she was walking into. The 7th floor was louder than she'd ever heard it at 4 in the morning. Not chaotic. Hospital staff didn't do chaos. They did controlled urgency, which had its own particular sound. She heard the biomonitor alarm from the corridor before she reached 709, and she could see through the open door that there were 4 people in the room already. Garrett, another floor nurse whose name she didn't know, a resident she recognized from the general medicine rotation, and Dr. Lena Voss, who was standing at the foot of the bed with a tablet in her hand and an expression that said she had already absorbed a significant amount of conflicting information in the last 15 minutes. Leo was not seizing anymore. The alarm was the tail end of the episode. His monitors showed a heart rate still elevated, O2 saturation at 91, and climbing, the EEG trace that someone had activated during the event showing the post-ictal pattern that followed a generalized tonic-clonic. He was still, but differently than his baseline still. There was a quality to it she couldn't have articulated in clinical language but recognized anyway. The exhausted stillness of something that had just fought very hard. Foss looked at her when she came through the door. "You're on modified duty," Foss said. "I know. Garrett called me." Mara moved to the side of the bed, eyes on the monitors. "How long did the seizure last?" 14 minutes. We were 60 seconds from intubating when it broke. Foss held up the tablet. "He has no seizure history in this chart. Nothing in 29 weeks of documentation that suggests a seizure threshold issue. I pulled his medication record, and there's a benzodiazepine dose that was administered at 11 p.m. Routine, it's in the standing orders. But the dosage has been the same for 6 months." "Who ordered the 11 p.m. dose?" "Standing orders. Voss's protocol." "Was anything changed in the standing orders today?" Voss was quiet for a moment. "That's what I'm looking at." She turned the tablet toward Mara. The standing orders were updated at 9:47 p.m. The benzodiazepine dose was increased by 40%. The number sat in the air between them. "Who authorized the update?" Mara asked. "Voss's credentials. He has remote authorization access for his patients." Foss set the tablet down. "I've already flagged it." The update was made approximately 3 hours after Breck recused himself from the case. Mara looked at Leo. His O2 was at 93 now, still climbing. His post-ictal state would last at minimum an hour, probably longer, and during that time he was even less able to communicate than his baseline, even if, especially if, what Price's assessment suggested was accurate. The seizure had bought Voss something. Not much, and not clean, but it had bought him a clinical event in the chart. An acute neurological deterioration in the hours before a board review. A data point that, read by someone who was looking for justification to maintain the original diagnosis, could be framed as evidence that Leo's status was declining rather than emerging. "I need you to document the medication change timestamp," Mara said, "and I need it cross-referenced with the timeline of Breck's recusal." "I already did," Foss said. She said it without inflection, which was the tone of someone who had looked at a situation and made a decision about it. "I also placed a hold on any further medication updates for this patient pending review. That's within my ER attending authority when a patient presents through emergency." She paused. "He didn't technically present through emergency. The seizure occurred on the ward." "But you responded to the emergency." "I did." They looked at each other. "The hold stands," Foss said, "until someone with more authority than me tells me to lift it. And whoever that person is going to have to explain the 40% dosage increase in writing." Voss arrived at 4:41. Mara heard him before he reached the room, his voice in the corridor, controlled but with an edge that hadn't been there in their previous conversations. He'd been the most powerful person in every room she'd encountered him in until now, and that was changing, and she could hear him adjusting to it in real time. The way the register of someone's voice shifted when they were recalibrating against a problem they hadn't fully anticipated. He came through the door and saw Foss first, then the chart on the tablet in her hand, then Mara. He stopped. "You're on modified duty," he said to her. "She's here in support of the patient's family," Foss said. "I've asked her to remain while I complete my emergency assessment. This is a neurology ward patient, not an ER case." He presented with a 14-minute generalized seizure with no prior seizure history and a medication change in the preceding hours. "That makes him an ER case until I determine otherwise." Voss's voice was exactly as level as Voss's. She was maybe 38, a decade his junior, and she did not look like someone who was going to move. "I've placed a medication hold pending review of the standing orders update made at 9:47 p.m. I'd like you to walk me through the clinical rationale for the dosage increase." The room was very quiet. Garrett had positioned himself near the door with the careful neutrality of someone who was witnessing something and understood that his job was to witness it accurately. "The dosage adjustment was within normal titration parameters," Voss said. "The increase was 40% over a dose that had been stable for 6 months, administered to a patient with a documented baseline neurological compromise and no sleep architecture changes in the recent record that would justify upward titration. Voss set the tablet down on the bedside tray. I'm going to need the clinical rationale documented. Tonight. Voss looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Mara, and what was in that look was not the measured professional concern he had deployed in every prior interaction. It was something stripped of its institutional framing, the actual content underneath, which was the particular expression of someone who understood they were losing ground and was deciding how far they were willing to go. This nurse, he said, is the subject of an active nursing board proceeding for scope violations at this institution. Her presence in this patient's room and her involvement in this clinical situation is inappropriate and should be documented. Noted, Voss said. I'll include it in my incident report, along with the medication timeline. Voss left the room. Not dramatically. He simply turned and walked out, which was in some ways worse than anything louder would have been, because it meant he was going somewhere to do something, and she didn't know yet what that was. First arrived at this hospital at 6:15 with a woman Mara hadn't met. Compact, 40-something, carrying a briefcase, introduced as Lieutenant Commander Adria Wells, the JAG attorney Firsch had mentioned. They met in a family consultation room on the 4th floor that Pendleton had apparently arranged access to, because he was already there when they arrived, sitting at the head of the table with the focused stillness of a man who had spent the night doing what senior officers did when the situation shifted, processing, planning, waiting for the moment to move. Mara sat down and gave them everything. The medication change, the timestamp, the seizure timeline, Voss's hold, Voss's response, all of it. Wells took notes and didn't react visibly to any of it, which Mara found either reassuring or unreadable. She wasn't sure which. The medication documentation gives us something we didn't have yesterday, Wells said when Mara finished. The nursing board charges are a personnel matter, and I can argue for a stay, but they're fundamentally a separate track from the clinical oversight issue. The medication change is different. That's a direct clinical action taken by the attending physician on a patient whose case is under active review, timed in a way that creates a very specific appearance. Can you stop the board review? Pendleton asked. I can request the board proceeding be suspended pending the Naval Medical Command investigation, which is now formally open. The grounds are that the charges were filed in response to documentation that is material evidence in a federal oversight matter. That argument has been made before and courts have generally supported it. She paused. What I can't do is guarantee the medical review board this morning goes the way we need it to go. The board has the authority to maintain Voss's care plan regardless of the external investigation, and they may choose to do that as a defensive institutional position. Unless the investigation is formally present at the board, Firsch said. Which it will be, Wells confirmed. I'll be there, and Commander Firsch will be there in her Naval Medical Command capacity. That changes the readout considerably for anyone on that board who is thinking about institutional exposure. Pendleton looked at Mara. How is Leo? Post-ictal, he'll be in that state for a few more hours. When he comes out of it, she stopped. He was showing the strongest responses we'd seen right before the seizure. Price will be back this morning. If he's stable enough, she can conduct a follow-up assessment. And if Voss tries to block her access? He can try, Wells said. But Voss's emergency hold is currently active, which means ER authority supersedes ward management for this patient. Price can be admitted as a family-requested consultant through the ER path. Pendleton nodded once. Then that's what we do. He stood, which meant the meeting was over, and then he stopped and looked at Mara with the expression of someone who had been a decision-maker for 30 years and had a specific recognition for the kind of person who changed the outcome of a situation they had no obligation to change. I've been asking my son to give me something to work with, he said quietly. He's not the only one who came through. The medical review board convened at 9 a.m. in a conference room on the administrative floor. It consisted of 5 physicians, none of them from neurology, all of them at the department head level, plus the CMO, Dr. Senge, who chaired it. Voss was present as the attending of record. Price was present as consulting physician. Wells sat at the table as legal representative for the patient's family. Firsch sat beside her in service dress, her Naval Medical Command credentials on the table in front of her, which created a particular atmospheric effect that Mara had hoped it would. Mara was not allowed in the room. She sat in the corridor outside on a chair someone had brought from a nearby office and waited, which was one of the harder things she'd done in a while. She could hear nothing through the door. The corridor had the particular quality of institutional waiting. The distant sounds of the hospital operating around her, carts and voices, and the persistent soft rhythm of the building's ventilation. While in that room, something was being decided that she had put in motion and could no longer touch. An hour and 20 minutes. That was how long it took. The door opened and Wells came out first, and her face was not the careful neutral of someone managing a bad outcome. It was the careful neutral of someone managing a significant one, which was different. The board has ordered comprehensive functional imaging, Wells said. Full fMRI with Price's covert cognition protocol to be conducted at Harwick University Medical under Price's supervision. Transport authorized within 24 hours. Mara looked at her. Voss retains attending status pending the Naval Medical Command investigation outcome, Wells continued. But his authority over Leo's care plan is suspended during the imaging process and subsequent review. A court-appointed medical guardian has been named for interim oversight. That's standard when there's a conflict between the family's position and the attending in an oversight context. And the medication issue. Referred to the state medical board for separate investigation. Wells held her gaze, along with the contractor conflict of interest documentation that Commander Fursch presented. The board chair, Dr. Senge, looked at that contractor file for about 90 seconds and then asked the board's legal counsel to step out of the room and make a call. I think that call went to the hospital's malpractice insurer. That was the sound of an institution recognizing its exposure and beginning to respond to it, which was not justice yet, but was the precondition for it. What about the nursing board charges? Mara asked. I filed for the stay this morning before the board convened, pending. You'll know within 48 hours. Wells allowed herself something that was almost an expression. For what it's worth, the CMO asked me, informally, to let you know that Carver is reconsidering the modified duty status. The transfer to Harwick took place the following afternoon. Leo was stable, post-ICTAL recovery complete, back to his baseline presentation, which Mara now understood as a baseline that was far more active than anyone had been accounting for. Price had conducted a second brief assessment that morning and documented responses consistent with her preliminary findings. Cleaner this time, more sustained because Leo had apparently had enough rest and the benzodiazepine correction had been running for 18 hours, and the difference was measurable. Mara rode in the transport. Not as a nurse, she had no clinical authority in the transport context, but as a family liaison, which was the designation Wells had arranged and which gave her a seat in the vehicle and a reason to be present that no one could efficiently object to. Leo was on a transport gurney, monitored, secured, with a flight medic from the Harwick team managing his clinical status during the 2-hour drive. For most of the drive, he appeared still. But somewhere in the last 20 minutes, in the particular way that she'd learned to watch for, his left hand moved. Not the directed response she'd been tracking, just a small restless movement, the kind that people made in sleep when something in their interior world shifted. She put her hand next to his on the blanket, not holding it, just adjacent, close enough that if he moved again, she'd feel it. He moved again. His fingers found her hand and rested there, not a grip, not a response to stimulus, just contact. The weight of a hand that had been alone in a room for 8 months and was currently in a vehicle moving somewhere new. She looked out the transport window at the highway moving past, at the November landscape going gray and spare, and she didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. The fMRI results came back 41 hours after admission to Harwick. Mara was in the family waiting area on the second floor when Price came to find her. Pendleton was there too, and he stood when Price walked in, which was the reflexive response of a man accustomed to standing when news walked into the room. Price sat down, which was not something she'd done in any of their previous interactions. She set the imaging report on the low table between them, and she looked at them both before she spoke, and her face had the expression of someone about to confirm something they had been working toward for a long time. and which was not uncomplicated. Leo is in a minimally conscious state plus, she said. The imaging shows intact language network processing. He understands speech. The motor pathway damage is significant, which is why his responses are limited and effortful. But his cortical activity during the command paradigm was unambiguous. She paused. He was answering our questions. We asked him to imagine playing tennis during the imaging. That's the standard motor imagery paradigm for this protocol. And he did. Clearly and repeatedly. That is not possible in a vegetative state. The room was quiet. How long has he been like this? Pendleton said. I can't date the onset precisely. The structural injury from the hypoxic event is real. There was damage, and it has limited his output significantly. But the functional imaging shows network activity that doesn't develop overnight. Based on the pattern, my best estimate is that some level of awareness has been present for most of the 8 months. She said it without flinching, because she was the kind of person who understood that the truth needed to be delivered intact in order to be useful. He has been aware of his environment, of people speaking to him, of time passing. At what level of detail I can't tell you yet, but he has been in there. Pendleton put his hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of someone containing something that would take a long time to process, and who was doing the containment in public because that was what was required of him right now. Mara looked at the imaging report without seeing it. 8 months. All right. What followed was not swift or clean or satisfying in the way that conclusions were supposed to be satisfying. It was institutional, which meant it was slow and contested and full of procedural language that kept the human reality at arm's length until you learned to read past it. The Naval Medical Command investigation formally expanded within 72 hours of the Harwick imaging results. The contractor, a firm called Meridian Medical Review Group, operating out of 3 states, had its Naval Medical Command contract suspended pending a conflict of interest audit. The lead reviewer on Leo's case, a Dr. Gareth Solis, submitted a written response through legal counsel that confirmed the existing financial relationship with Carver while contesting the characterization of it as a conflict. The investigation did not find his response persuasive. Voss was placed on administrative leave by Carver Medical Center on the 4th day after the Harwick results, not because the hospital had concluded he'd done anything wrong. That language would come later, through the state medical board, but because, as Dr. Senge told the assembled department heads in a closed meeting that Wells later described to Mara, the hospital's exposure in the current situation required clear structural distance between the institution and the attending physician at the center of the review. It was the institutional version of cutting someone loose. Professional, documented, and without the vocabulary of accountability. The state medical board opened a formal investigation into Voss's medication update on the night before the review board convening. That investigation would take time, months, not weeks, but its existence was public record, and public record had a way of weight-bearing in a career context that administrative leave alone did not. Mara was reinstated to full duty at Carver on the 6th day, the nursing board stay having been granted the morning after the Harwick results became part of the official case file. Patricia Ellery called her personally to convey the reinstatement, which was not required and which meant something. The call was brief and practical and ended with Patricia saying, "Your assignment is open if you want it," which was not an apology but was probably the closest thing to one that the situation was going to generate. She took the assignment. She went back to 7. She went back to her rounds. She carried her coffee thermos that had been through a flood and a deployment, and she signed in at the nursing station, and most of the people on the floor who looked at her did so with a slightly different quality of attention than they'd had before, though nobody said anything directly, because direct was not generally how hospitals processed events of this kind. The exception was Garrett, who brought her a coffee from the machine down the hall on her first night back and set it on the station counter without comment. She looked at it and then at him. "I didn't do anything," he said. "You called me," she said, "and you told Foss about the oversight flag." He shrugged in the way of someone who wasn't comfortable with the category of thing he'd done being acknowledged. "I just didn't want to... I don't know. I didn't want to be the person who didn't do that." She understood that completely. That's said. 3 weeks after the Harwick imaging, Leo Pendleton spoke for the first time. It was not a word, technically. It was a sound that approximated a word, a labored approximation of here, produced in response to a direct question from Price during a rehabilitation assessment, in a room at Harwick with his father and 2 speech therapists present. The sound was effortful and imprecise and lasted less than a second. Price described it in her clinical notes as voluntary vocalization with apparent intentional phonemic targeting, which was the clinical language for, "he is trying to talk." Mara was not in the room. She was informed by Pendleton that evening via a text message that said only, "He said something." She sat with her phone for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket and went back to her rounds, because there were 7 other patients on her assignment, and 3 of them needed medication checks, and 1 of them had been asking about a pain management update since 8 p.m. And this was the work. And it continued whether or not anything monumental had just happened in a room 200 miles away. But she was walking slightly differently. She didn't notice it until Garrett pointed it out later, near the end of the shift. "You're smiling," he said. "Am I?" "You kind of are. It's new." She didn't confirm or deny that. She picked up the next chart. The formal findings of the Naval Medical Command investigation were published in a summary document 6 weeks later, and what they described was not a single failure, but a layered one, the kind that required multiple points of breakdown to function, which was always how the worst outcomes happened. Not one person making a catastrophic decision, but several people making smaller decisions that each preserved their own position and collectively left a 24-year-old man without advocacy in a hospital room for 8 months. Meridian Medical Review Group's Naval Medical Command contract was terminated. Dr. Solis's finding on Leo's case was formally characterized as compromised by undisclosed conflict of interest and was expunged from the federal case file. Voss's administrative leave became an indefinite suspension of privileges at Carver Medical Center pending the outcome of the State Medical Board investigation, which had expanded its scope in the week since opening to include a review of 3 other long-term patients in Voss's care whose imaging had been similarly limited to structural modalities without functional follow-up. Whether those cases would yield findings comparable to Leo's was not yet known. Brecht's early recusal and the written statement he subsequently provided to the investigation describing his awareness of the collegial relationship between Voss and Solis had positioned him in a legally awkward but professionally survivable location. He was a witness in an investigation rather than a subject of one, which was a distinction that his legal counsel had apparently moved quickly to establish. Mara didn't have strong feelings about that. He had stepped back when it mattered. That wasn't nothing. The investigation summary contained 1 paragraph near the end that she read 3 times, in the break room on 7, during a 20-minute window between rounds. The case of the patient at the center of this review represents a systemic failure of independent oversight mechanisms designed to protect vulnerable patients. The initial clinical assessment may have reflected the genuine limitations of structural imaging technology available at the time of evaluation. However, the subsequent absence of functional reassessment, the failure to respond to documented clinical signals, and the actions taken in the immediate period preceding the Medical Review Board convening suggest a pattern of institutional self-protection that displaced patient welfare as the primary consideration. The patient's documented recovery of communicative function following appropriate assessment and intervention confirms that timely action could have altered the course of his care substantially. Could have altered the course of his care substantially. She set her phone down. She thought about what that paragraph was not saying because it was a federal document, and federal documents didn't say the human part. It was not saying he was alone in that room. It was not saying he could hear everything. It was not saying someone chose their reputation over his awareness and called it medical consensus. She picked up her coffee and went back to work. She had 4 patients to check before midnight, and one of them had a family member sleeping in the chair by his bed who was going to need someone to quietly bring them a blanket. And the blanket supply on 7 was in the 3rd cabinet of the linen closet, which she now knew the way she knew every supply room in every facility she'd ever worked. By necessity, by repetition, by the accumulation of small practical knowledge that constituted most of what the job actually was. She found the blanket. She brought it to the room. She set it over the sleeping woman without waking her, and she checked the patient's monitors, and she went back out to the corridor. At the end of the hall, the door to 709 was open. There was a new patient in there now, a 60-year-old man 3 days post-stroke, who would probably be moved to rehab within the week. She could see the edge of his monitor screen from where she stood. She stood there for a moment, looking at the open door. Then she went to the nursing station and picked up the next chart, and she kept working, the way she always did, in the particular silence of someone who had never needed to be told they'd done something that mattered, because she'd known the whole time, and knowing had been enough to keep her moving when nothing else was. Until her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Different from the one Fersh had used, different from anyone she recognized. Short, no greeting, no context. 3 lines. Meridian had 16 federal contracts. Your case cracked the file open. There are 11 other patients across 4 states whose cases were reviewed by Solis under the same conflict structure. A pause. Then a 4th line. We need your documentation methodology. Formal consult. Can you travel? She read it twice. Then she looked up at the quiet corridor, at the overnight hospital humming around her with its controlled rhythms and its accumulated weight of human need. She typed back, "Who is this?" The response came in under 30 seconds, and when she read the name attached to it and the organization, she understood that what she'd started in a single quiet room on a night shift in Drayfield had not concluded with Leo Pendleton waking up. It had only just become something larger than itself. The name on the screen was Dr. Renata Osei, and the organization listed beneath it was the Office of Patient Safety Oversight at the Department of Health and Human Services, a federal body that operated in the narrow, unglamorous space between medical institutions and the people those institutions were supposed to protect. Mara stared at the message long enough that Garrett, passing the station with a medication tray, glanced at her. "You okay?" "Yeah," she said. "Give me a minute." She typed back, "When and where?" Osei's response was immediate, like she'd been waiting. "Washington, 2 weeks. We'll cover travel. Bring everything. Your original notebook, the chart documentation timeline, the Harwick imaging cross-reference. This isn't a deposition. It's a working session. We're building a protocol." Mara read it twice. Then she put the phone in her scrubs pocket and stood at the nursing station for a moment with her hand flat on the counter, looking at the corridor, at the ordinary nighttime landscape of a hospital floor. The monitors, the carts, the low institutional lighting, the distant sound of someone's television through a closed door. She thought about the 11 patients. She thought about what it meant that they were out there, in rooms somewhere, in buildings that probably looked like this one, with charts that had been reviewed by Solis and signed off and filed, with families who had been counseled and who had made decisions based on those reviews, with whatever interior lives they were carrying unwitnessed in the silence between assessments. She typed, "I'll be there." She didn't leave Carver. That was the first thing people seemed to expect after that she'd move on, take a position at Harwick, or leverage the attention the investigation had generated into something more prestigious, more insulated from the kind of institutional friction she'd just spent 6 weeks navigating. Patricia Ellery asked her about it indirectly, about 2 weeks after her reinstatement, in the careful way people ask questions they weren't sure they had standing to ask. "You could go anywhere right now," Patricia said. "I know," Mara said. "I'm not suggesting you should. I know what you're saying." Mara looked at her. 7 still needs a night shift. Patricia had no immediate response to that, which was fine. It wasn't a statement that required a response. The work on 7 was unchanged, which was the thing about hospital work that some people found grinding and that Mara found, if not exactly comforting, then at least honest. Patients needed what they needed, regardless of what had happened in conference rooms and federal offices and imaging suites in other cities. The medication checks and repositioning intervals and family conversations at 2 in the morning didn't pause for institutional reckonings. She went back to her rounds, and she was good at them, and that was sufficient. And the weeks passed with the ordinary accumulation of small, significant things that constituted the actual texture of the job. She flew to Washington on a Thursday morning in January through cold that had settled over the Northeast and showed no intention of moving. The Office of Patient Safety Oversight was in a federal building in the northeast quadrant of the city, the kind of building that communicated authority through sheer architectural plainness, pale stone, narrow windows, a lobby with a security desk, and not much else. Dr. Renata Osei was 47, tall, with the economical manner of someone who had spent 2 decades in bureaucratic contexts and had learned to get more done in less time than most people thought was possible. She shook Mara's hand in the lobby and said, "I've read everything twice. We have a lot to get through," and led her to a conference room where 3 other people were already waiting with laptops and printed materials and coffee that had been sitting long enough to develop that particular federal meeting bitterness. What followed was not glamorous. It was 6 hours of working session, methodical, technical, occasionally frustrating, during which Mara walked them through every step of her assessment process, every decision point, every piece of documentation, and the team across the table asked the kind of questions that were aimed not at the specifics of Leo's case, but at the underlying method. What she'd looked for, how she'd distinguished directed response from reflexive noise, what the diurnal pattern had told her and why, how she'd structured the chart documentation to be clinically defensible rather than easy to dismiss. The goal, as Osei laid it out in the first hour, was a standardized protocol, something that could be taught to nursing staff across institutions that would give floor nurses a structured framework for flagging potential awareness in patients diagnosed with disorders of consciousness, and that would establish a chain of documentation that made those flags difficult for attending physicians to dismiss without formal engagement. The problem in the Pendleton case wasn't that the signals weren't there, Osei said. The problem was that the person who saw them had no formal mechanism to escalate that didn't run directly through the physician whose diagnosis she was questioning. We need a parallel pathway. An ombudsman structure, Mara said, essentially, with teeth, tied to the facility's federal certification obligations. Osei made a note. Your documentation methodology is the clinical foundation. We need to turn it into something reproducible. They worked until 4:30. When they were done, Osei walked her back to the lobby and they stood by the security desk while Mara put her visitor badge in the return slot. You understand this is going to take time, Osei said. Protocol development, institutional review, federal rulemaking. If we go that route, we're looking at 18 months minimum before anything is formally in place. I know how institutions move, Mara said. And you're willing to stay involved through the development process? Yes. Osei looked at her for a moment with the appraising attention of someone who had worked with a lot of people and had specific criteria for which ones were worth building something around. Can I ask you something? Yes. When you walked into that room the first night, 7:09, before you documented anything, before you talked to anyone, what made you stay? You could have written it off. A lot of people would have. Mara thought about that room, the specific quality of its silence, the monitors, the hand. He moved, she said, and nobody was watching. Osei nodded slowly. That's what I thought. She held out her hand. We'll be in touch, said. The State Medical Board issued its findings on Aldrin Voss in the 3rd week of February, 14 weeks after the investigation opened. The findings were specific, which was what Mara had told Pendleton they needed to be, because vague findings were the kind that allowed institutional memory to soften over time into something more comfortable than the original facts. These were not vague. The board found that Voss had failed to pursue available diagnostic modalities in a patient presenting with clinical signals inconsistent with the assigned diagnosis, and that this failure had persisted across an 8-month period despite documented opportunities for reassessment. The finding did not use the word negligence in its formal designation because medical board language had its own careful vocabulary, but the supporting documentation used words like pattern of omission and failure to exercise independent clinical judgment in the context of institutional pressure that communicated the same territory in terms that would be legible to any licensing body. His clinical privileges at Carver Medical Center were revoked permanently. The board additionally required him to appear before a formal hearing within 60 days to determine whether his medical license would be suspended or conditioned going forward. That hearing was public record. The outcome of it, a 2-year license suspension with conditions for reinstatement, including supervised practice and demonstrated competency review, was published in the state's medical board public registry, where it would remain. Mara read the summary on her phone during a break, sitting in the supply room off the 7 corridor with a cup of coffee and 12 minutes before she needed to be back on the floor. She read it once, all the way through. Then she put the phone away. She didn't feel the satisfaction she'd thought she might. Not because the outcome was insufficient, it was specific, and it was consequential, and it was public, which were the 3 things that made accountability mean something. But it was also not the point, and it had never been the point. And sitting with the board findings, she was mainly aware of the distance between what had happened to Voss and what had happened to Leo, between the measurable institutional consequence and the thing that couldn't be put in a document, the 8 months. The room. Whatever he'd been carrying in there, alone, without a name for what was happening to him. That didn't have a resolution. It had a continuation, which was different. Set. Leo walked for the first time in March. Not independently, and not far. 6 steps, with a gait trainer and a physical therapist on each side, and Price watching from the doorway of the rehabilitation gym at Harwick with a clipboard she wasn't writing on. But he walked, and when he stopped and gripped the trainer rails and looked up, his father was at the end of the short distance he'd covered, and whatever passed between them in that moment was not something Mara could have described in clinical language or any other kind. She was there because Pendleton had called her the week before and said simply, "He wants you there." She stood to the side of the room and watched. She had her hands in the pockets of her civilian jacket because she'd come directly from the airport and hadn't changed, and she looked like what she was. A night shift nurse from Drayfield, Massachusetts, in an airport coat standing in a rehabilitation gym in Providence, watching a young man take 6 steps. Leo turned his head toward her after. His speech was still labored. The motor pathway damage meant that words cost him considerably more than they cost most people, each one requiring an effort that showed in his face. But he'd been working with the speech team for 2 months, and the progress was real, incremental, stubborn, in the way that recovery from serious neurological injury was stubborn, not linear, not fast, not without setbacks, but real. He looked at her and he said, with the specific, effortful precision of someone who had chosen this word carefully, "Thank." Not thank you, just the first part, because the second part was 1 syllable too many for where he was right now. She nodded. She didn't say "you're welcome" because it felt like the wrong response, too social, too reflexive for what the word had actually cost him. She said, "I know," which was true, and which seemed to land correctly, because he held her eyes for a moment and then looked back at his father, and the therapists helped him turn the gait trainer and begin the 6 steps back. The nursing board formally withdrew the charges against Mara in April, following a review that concluded the documentation she'd entered into Leo's chart was within appropriate nursing scope and that the original charges had been filed under circumstances constituting institutional retaliation, a finding that had specific language implications for Carver Medical Center's accreditation self-assessment, which was due that year. The letter arrived in her email at 6:17 in the morning, which was the end of her shift, and she read it at the nursing station while Garrett was doing his own end-of-shift charting beside her. She read it, and then she set her phone face down on the counter and sat with it for a moment. "Good news or bad news?" Garrett asked, not looking up from his chart. "Charges dropped," she said. He put his pen down. He looked at her. Then he picked his pen back up and went back to his chart and said, "About time," in the flat tone of someone who had been waiting for something and was not going to perform a reaction because the thing had been correct all along, and correctness didn't require celebration, just acknowledgement. She appreciated that. She appreciated it specifically. She signed out, walked to the service entrance, and stood in the April morning for a moment. Warmer than October had been, the harbor light different, the city in the particular early morning stillness of a Thursday before the machinery of the day started up. She'd stood in roughly this same spot on the worst night of it, reading Fersh's texts, not knowing what the name on her screen was going to become. She thought about what Ose had asked her in the Washington lobby. What made you stay? The honest answer was more complicated than what she'd said, which was the true version of a more complicated truth. She'd stayed because the alternative, writing it off, adding it to the archive of things that were wrong and too large to fix and therefore not her problem, had felt in that specific room, on that specific night, like a kind of violence she didn't have the capacity to commit. That was not heroism. It was not even choice, exactly. It was more like the absence of a certain kind of self-protective blindness that some people had and she did not. She had never been good at not seeing things. It had cost her, in the Army and in other contexts, in ways she still carried. But it was also the only instrument she had that was worth anything, and you worked with what you had, and you kept working, and sometimes, not always, not reliably, but sometimes, the working produced something that outlasted the cost. The protocol document that emerged from the Office of Patient Safety Oversight 7 months after the Washington working session was 43 pages long and unglamorous in the way that policy documents were unglamorous, dense, precise, cross-referenced to federal regulatory frameworks that most people would never read. It was titled Guidance on Nursing Assessment and Escalation Protocols for Patients with Disorders of Consciousness in Acute and Long-Term Care Settings, which was exactly the kind of title that caused most people's eyes to glaze over within 3 words. Mara was listed in the acknowledgments as primary clinical consultant, which was a line that nobody outside the specific world of federal health policy would ever read. She read it. She read it sitting in the break room on 7 at 3 in the morning. On the tablet, she'd downloaded the PDF to, with a coffee going cold beside her and the floor quiet around her. She read every page, including the footnotes, because she knew where every clause had come from, which argument, which documented failure, which specific signal she'd been watching for in a room that smelled like bleach and institutional silence. Page 17 contained the core of what she'd built, translated into the formal language of federal guidance, a structured observation protocol for nursing staff, with specific behavioral markers, documentation requirements, and a mandatory escalation pathway that ran parallel to the attending physician chain and reported directly to the facility's patient safety officer. It had teeth. Facilities that failed to implement it risked federal certification conditions. It was not perfect. It was a policy document, and policy documents were always compromises between what was necessary and what was politically survivable. And this one had been through 14 rounds of revision and 2 rounds of interagency review and had emerged somewhat leaner than what she'd originally proposed. But it was there. And being there meant that somewhere, in some hospital, on some floor, a night shift nurse who noticed something wrong would have a formal framework that hadn't existed before, a documented, federally backed pathway that said, "You saw something, here is how to make it matter." She closed the PDF and picked up her coffee and went back to the corridor. She went to see Leo in May, 6 months after the transport to Harwick, on a Saturday afternoon when the Rhode Island coast was doing its best version of spring. He was in an outpatient rehabilitation appointment, and she met him and Pendleton afterward at a coffee place 2 blocks from the Harwick campus that had outdoor seating and was busy enough that the ambient noise created a kind of privacy. Leo was thinner than he'd been in his pre-injury photographs, which she'd seen exactly once, in a framed picture in 709 that his father had placed on the windowsill sometime in the months before she'd arrived. He moved carefully, with the deliberate economy of someone who was managing a body that didn't yet fully cooperate. His speech had improved significantly. He still chose his words with the particular efficiency of someone for whom each one was an expenditure. But the sentences were coming, and they were his. They sat with coffee, and the 3 of them talked, or did the uneven thing that passed for talking when one person was working harder than the others to participate and didn't want accommodation and didn't want pity, and was very clear about both of those things without having to state them. Pendleton was different from how he'd been in October. Not softer, exactly. He wasn't a soft man and wasn't going to become one, but there was something in him that had rearranged. The kind of rearrangement that happened when something you'd stopped allowing yourself to hope for came back. And the coming back didn't erase what had passed, but it did change what you were living toward. At some point, Leo looked at her across the table and said, with deliberate precision, "I heard you the first night." She went still. "You said—" He paused, managing the sentence. "He's still in there." She remembered saying it, in the dark of 709 to no one, under her breath, not for an audience. A private conclusion, stated quietly in a room she'd believed was not receiving it. She looked at him. "I heard everything," he said. "For a long time, I just couldn't." He stopped. His jaw worked. Couldn't get back. The coffee place moved around them. Cups and voices and the ordinary noise of a Saturday afternoon in a city that had no knowledge of what was sitting at this particular table. "I know," she said. And then, because it was true and because he'd earned the real version rather than the careful one, "I'm sorry it took so long." He shook his head. It was a small movement, but it was clear. "You came," he said. That was all. 2 words that carried the weight of everything they replaced. Pendleton looked at the harbor in the distance and pressed his thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose for a moment, and nobody commented on it. The thing about being the person who sees what others don't is that it doesn't make you special. That was what Mara had learned and kept learning in the months that followed. Not just from Leo's case, but from the 11 others that Osei's team worked through over the following year. Cases she consulted on remotely from her break room and her kitchen table, and occasionally from the parking garage of Carver Medical Center when she needed to take a call in a place where nobody could overhear. She was not special. She was trained and she was paying attention, and she had not had the right kind of self-protective instinct that tells most people when a fight is too large for their rank. That combination was not rare. It existed in nurses and medics and social workers and teachers and every other profession where the work required sustained attention to people who couldn't fully advocate for themselves. It was not celebrated mostly because celebration required visibility, and the work that needed this combination most happened in the spaces that institutions kept dim: night shifts, ward ends, long-term units where the patients weren't getting better, and the charts accumulated and the consensus calcified. What had happened with Leo was not a story about one exceptional person defeating a corrupt system. It was a story about a system that had been specifically designed to not hear certain voices, and what happened when someone refused to accept that the design was permanent. That was a quieter story than the version that got told in the formal findings and the protocol citations and the newspaper piece that one of the Providence papers ran 6 months after Leo's imaging, which described him as the patient who defied all odds, and mentioned Mara in the 3rd paragraph as the nurse who raised the alarm. She'd read that piece and then put it down and not read it again, because it missed the actual shape of it in the way that most compressed narratives miss the actual shape of things. The actual shape was one woman, a notebook, a night shift, and the specific refusal to decide that what she saw was not her problem. The rest had followed from that. Imperfectly, slowly, at great institutional cost, with the assistance of people like Fursh and Price and Osei and Foss and even Garrett with his machine coffee, all of whom had their own versions of that refusal, their own moments of choosing to see rather than turn away. That was not a story with a single hero. It was a story about what happened when a few people, in the same window of time, decided that the official account of a situation was insufficient and acted on that decision despite the considerable incentive to do otherwise. In June, on a warm evening in Drayfield, she went to the harbor. It was not intentional. She'd been to the grocery store 3 blocks away and had extra time before her shift and ended up walking down to the waterfront in the particular aimless way of someone who needed to be outside for a while without a specific destination. She sat on a bench at the end of a public pier and watched the water move, which was what she'd come to understand the harbor was for in this city. It sat at the edge of everything and absorbed whatever you brought to it without comment. She thought about the patients in Osei's case file. Not all 11 had Leo's outcome. 2 of them, she knew now, had injuries severe enough that the imaging had confirmed what the original diagnosis had claimed. And that was its own kind of grief, the grief of looking clearly at something and finding that the terrible assessment had been correct. 3 others were in active rehabilitation, varying stages, varying prognosis. The remaining 6 were still in assessment phases, still uncertain, still in the middle of the thing. She thought about what she'd said to Price on the phone, months ago, when Price had asked why she was doing it. Because he squeezed back. And nobody else in that hospital is going to do anything about it. That was still true. That was still the whole of it. The harbor moved. A light came on across the water in a building she didn't know the purpose of. A gull crossed low and disappeared. She thought about how easy it would have been to let that first night in 709 be unremarkable, how available that choice had been. A new shift, an unfamiliar patient, a documented consensus, a floor full of other people who had been looking at the same room for months and seen nothing that required action. She could have read the chart and done her rounds and gone home and slept her 4 hours and come back the next night. The ward would have continued. The machines would have run. Leo would have been there. And in that version of the world, she would never have known what she'd missed, because not knowing and not looking were the same motion, and the world was full of people who had learned to perform both so fluently that it no longer cost them anything. She had never learned that. She wasn't sure if that was a virtue or a defect or simply a fact about her, like the scar on her jaw or the coffee thermos or the 4 hours of sleep. It was what she was, and it had brought her to a parking garage at 6 in the morning reading texts from a woman she hadn't seen in 3 years, and to a hospital room in the middle of the night watching a hand move, and to a federal office in Washington arguing for a policy that would spend 18 months in committee before anyone's name went on it, and eventually to a bench at the end of a pier in Drayfield watching the harbor go dark. Her shift started in 2 hours. She had a full assignment, and one of her patients was a 40-year-old man 3 weeks post-cardiac event who'd been quiet in a way she wanted to check on. And another was an elderly woman whose family visited every day without fail and always left looking more exhausted than when they'd arrived, which was a different kind of signal than the clinical ones, but a signal nonetheless. She stood up. She put her hands in her pockets.